Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video here on my channel. My name is Ruben Garta, and I'm an expert in analytics. Now, today we are talking about Amplitude. There's many videos on my channel here on Amplitude, different tools and reports, but I wanted to do one single video showing you how to get started with Amplitude in less than 60 minutes. So we'll see how long this video ends up being, but it'll give you a good understanding of the use cases of Amplitude. We'll look at the pricing to understand what this is looking like. I'm recording this in 2024, so the pricing can always change. We're going to look at the tracking plan, a critical step before you ever write any code. We're going to look at some implementation best practices. And of course, we're then going to jump right into the product itself. And I want to show you what I believe are the most important reports, segmentation, funnels, dashboards, how to use them, how they work, and you can get a good feel for how this tool actually can help your company get more insights. Now, a little bit about me, if this is your first video. I work now with over 90 organizations. A lot of them are tech companies, tech startups, from very small to larger fintech and venture-backed companies. Some logos will appear in front of you. And over that time, we've gone through a lot of different tools. You know, what are the best tools for product analytics or for market analytics, or if you're going to look at a CDP, a customer data platform like segment.com, what does that look like? So this is just one tool in the stack for many companies, even for a product team that might have multiple tools in the stack. But Amplitude can do a lot. And it's really a fantastic tool for product analytics. In this space, in my mind, there's really just two primary tools that get talked about a lot, either Amplitude or Mixpanel. I did another video of Mixpanel similar to this, so you can watch that if you want to compare. So now we get to look at the other sort of major tool in the space and how they approach the same problems. So let's jump right in. As always, I'm going to share my screen here. I think it's the best way to really demonstrate the things that we're talking about. You know, data, of course, is highly visual, so we're going to look at a lot of charts and images and things like that. But let's start on the homepage with Amplitude, right? Just to see how they think of themselves for their tool and what they're trying to put forth in their positioning. Amplitude really started as a product analytics tool. I think even today, they still follow that line very closely. They develop a lot of features very specific for product teams. You can see here the scrolling logos of companies. These are some of the big companies, Fortune 500 companies. And they typically are working with the product teams inside these companies, especially the teams that tend to have some kind of digital app or digital product, whether a mobile app, a web app. Websites can work for Amplitude, though perhaps Amplitude might be a little bit too powerful for just a simple website. But nonetheless, there's a lot of benefit to using it for providing self-serve analytics, right? If you have a team, if you have engineers who can write SQL, this might not be the best tool for you. But if your team may not be as technical, or you want something that's a little bit faster than just writing SQL, this is where Amplitude can really start to shine. So you can see that it all kind of boils down to how you can improve and grow your product. What is the onboarding conversion rate? Where are people dropping off? How can we improve those drop-offs? How can we run some kind of A/B test experiment? What about retention? What about future engagement? If we release a new feature, what does that look like, right? I worked with a fitness company recently that they had all kinds of questions around usage. When are people actually watching the first video? What are people doing during their 7-day trial? What kind of things should we emphasize in our communication to them that's going to make them more likely to convert from a free trial to a paying subscriber? Once they become a paying subscriber, what should we be doing in the first 30 days or 90 days? What are kind of like the key milestones that we should be driving these users to complete in terms of workouts, in terms of other features in the app, and so forth? These are all the questions that Amplitude will start to help you answer in a very, very quick manner once you have the data in there. Let's see what else I want to highlight here. A lot of feature adoption, feature engagement. Another company I work with, they just released a mobile app and they wanted to see how it's being adopted. Very rapidly, we can build a dashboard, with 5-8 different charts showing that adoption over time and how it's changing and increasing on sort of these key metrics that were defined ahead of time. Something that's interesting too is Amplitude over time has built other features on top of their sort of core product analytics product, like a CDP. A CDP is a customer data platform. Typically, the company that gets most associated with the CDP word is segment.com. You may have seen mParticle, maybe RudderStack. the premise is quite simple. You have lots of data sources where you're pulling data from. Could be a website, could be an iOS app, an Android app, could be some kind of, let's say, revenue source like Stripe. So you take all those sources of data and then you send them to even more destinations. Destinations could be as simple as Amplitude itself, of course. It could be a data warehouse. It could be Google Analytics. It could be your marketing communication like MailChimp or Customer IO or Braze. So many companies typically have 5, 6, maybe even 10 destinations, and writing code for every single destination could be quite time consuming. And of course, you then have to maintain it. So CDPs say, hey, you're going to implement once with us, whether that is segment.com, Empirical, or in this case, Amplitude, and then we'll do some of the translation for you. Now, we'll look at the CDP here in more detail. It's not quite comparable to segment.com. I'll show you some of the ways it differs. But nonetheless, it is an intriguing add-on that can make Amplitude even more valuable as a standalone tool within your stack. Now, I'll save some of the reports for later in the video so you can see exactly what it means to do product analytics or web analytics, session replay. This has typically been the realm of tools like Hotjar, Full Story. Microsoft Clarity has a tool now where you can watch the sessions of users. So there's videos that you can watch of users interacting with your product, and they can be a very helpful way to get qualitative data. So Amplitude is bringing this into the product itself. Again, just another way to make it more useful and easier for product teams to really understand what's going on with the product. Now, that being said, let's look at pricing. Now, the pricing for Amplitude has changed a lot. I've been doing this for about 10 years. I've seen different iterations of pricing. Today, Amplitude charges by MTUs. These are monthly track users. Think about it as unique users that come to your product. There's two primary ways that companies charge in the space. It's either by MTUs, number of users, or by number of events. Mixpanel, since it is the main competitor, right now they are charging by events. There's pros and cons to each approach. I find, for example, consumer products, like a fitness app, as I was discussing earlier, they tend to benefit from an event pricing model. They can send lots of events. I think Mixpanel, I think the initial plan is something like 20 million events. 20 million events it can be a lot of events that you can manage in different ways. So consumer apps tend to have lots of users, low value per users. So the MTU plans are perhaps not as ideal for them. On the other hand, a B2B product will have a low number of users, but a high value for those users. Typically, organizations, small businesses, things like that. So B2B products tend to benefit from MTUs, and they can just send lots of events. Either way, there's always ways you can adapt your tracking plan based on whatever limits you have of either MTUs or events. And I'll show you that when we look at the tracking plan. You can prioritize what are the most important events that you want to start with, and perhaps you then add on over time. So Amplitude has a free plan, as we can see here. We can see right now this goes up to 50K MTUs. And then you get some of the foundational reports that we'll see in a second. Typically, anything that uses machine learning in some shape or form is not in a free plan. And in fact, it might actually be all the way in the what they call growth, what we might consider like an enterprise level plan. So Amplitude has several machine learning reports. Today, they might even be called AI powered reports, but they've been around for several years. And they can be very helpful if you have the enough data volume to use them. Now, the middle plan, where I think many companies will fall in, at least especially to start, it starts at different rates. I do like that they have a calculator here, so you can take your MTUs, your monthly MTUs, and then kind of get an estimate for what this might cost you on a monthly basis, whether you pay annually or you pay monthly. The most common way that people estimate this is just by looking at your Google Analytics data. Almost every company has Google Analytics in some shape or form. And you can then understand how many users are coming here. You do have to understand two factors for your MTUs. One is the number of users who engage with your product. That is, who are logged in, they signed up, and they're using the product. That may be one number. And then you likely have a second number of users who visit your website but never actually engage with your product. These are typically called anonymous users. Depending on how much traffic you're driving, whether you're engaging in paid campaigns, you may have a large number of anonymous users and a small number of engaged users relative to each other. Again, think about some consumer product that is doing a lot of paid spending on Facebook ads and Google ads and so on. They may have, let's say, 200,000 empty anonymous users, but perhaps only 30, 40,000 known users that are actually engaged with the product. So you can either add those up and get a total number, or once again, this is where you can start to make some priorities. Perhaps you start by only tracking known users who have logged in or signed up. So you start with a smaller number, and then over time, perhaps you bring anonymous users. I've done all kinds of sort of different permutations along this way to be able to get started uh, and make the pricing work. Now, some things I want to highlight here. If you go down here, again, basic things like reports and dashboards are all there. Some of the things that will not be there, cohorts, for example, this will be very helpful to group users. Some of the common cohorts are things like new users over the last 30 days or new subscribers, perhaps users who are at risk of cancellation or churning. Those are kind of things you start to create cohorts. And then once you have these cohorts, you can then take them and run lots of analysis along the way. Again, some of the advanced behavioral analysis, this is typically machine learning reports of sort, and I'll show you a few of those. They can be pretty fun and interesting. And then once you go down here, you see a lot of it. It tends to be either sort of machine learning power, like conversion drivers, maybe some of the anomaly detection and so on. Typically things that start to make a lot of sense once you are in a larger plan, whether the growth or enterprise here. Session replay. This is kind of interesting. I find, this is just being added to Amplitude. I think Mixpanel just added the same thing. A lot of people tend to have a tool like this already because it's, again, for a long time, it wasn't inside Amplitude. So you may have like a Hotjar or Microsoft Clarity. I believe Microsoft Clarity actually doesn't charge for the product, which is unusual. But nonetheless, that's one option. Future flags. If you want to track specific features in the product, again, some of the specific things. The CDP component that we talked about earlier, we'll look at that in more second. Some user privacy, data management, and of course the typical support and so on. So I find when I work at companies, I want them to get a specific plan that makes sense, that's not too overwhelming. A lot of times companies need to prove the value of these tools before they're committed to paying, $20, $30, $50,000 a year. So you want to find some kind of balance to say, what, we can start with this. We can, we have $1,000 a month, 12,000 a year. That gives us X amount of MTUs. Let's take the middle plan. So we get a good number of features, not all of them, but a good number. And then over the next 6 months, we're going to kind of prove the value of this. That's typically my recommendation for pricing. What can you do initially? How can you give yourself 6, 12 months to really prove the value of the tool, to get the tool adopted, to get reports built in? And then from there, you can add more events, you can track more users, you can then upgrade to bigger plans. All right, so let's move on to the tracking plan. This is a critical step before you ever write any code. Let me show you exactly what that is. So here's a tracking plan, and I'm going to put this link in the description box below. It's just a Google Sheets link. There's no paywall, no email download. Just go in, you can make your own copy. Tracking plans is just a way for us to outline all the events that we need to track in our tool. You can do this in Google Sheets. You can do this in Excel. You can do this in just a regular document. I guess you could do it in a whiteboard if you really wanted to. What we want to do here, and typically what my approach is to take a product, and I want to note all the different events that users can take throughout the product. Events are just action. So here's an example. This is an e-commerce example, and we're going to look at some e-commerce data later, so we have some continuity here. And in an e-commerce store, the events are, for example, they can click on a product, they can view a product, they might add a product to their shopping cart, right? Or maybe remove the product from the shopping cart. They view the cart, they start the checkout steps, they finish the order, and so forth. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing all the potential events that users can engage in this e-commerce store. If we were to move on to like a mobile game, this is an example based on Bejeweled, the little colorful game there. Again, we have all the examples. We might have onboarding events, all the game events. They can reveal hints, they can pause the game, they can purchase things, and so on. So I want to track them all. I want to list them all here in this plan. I might have 20, 30, 40 rows for all the actions. Not every row is important, and you're not going to implement every single row. But I find it really helpful to put them all here and see them all in one spot. Once you do, the real magic of the tracking plan is being able to edit things, to condense them and make them more logical. So generally, the main recommendation for a tracking plan is all the data should be obvious to anyone who works in your company. So for someone who works in this e-commerce store, they can look at this data in the Amplitude dropdowns, and they can see something like product added, and they can see, okay, great, that's when the product gets added to cart. Or they can see something like order completed, and they know, okay, this is the purchase event. They should be obvious. I have seen data implementations that are not obvious. They're just abstractions of I have no idea what, and it just makes everything harder. The more obvious the data is, for again, within your company, the easier it'll be to adopt it. So you want to use whatever language you use internally to think about this data, and that's your name of the events. That's the names of the properties. For example, here in this order completed, we have properties, and the properties simply tell us more about a specific action. So we know this is an order, we know this is a purchase. Now we may want to know other things about the order. For example, what was the total revenue, right? What were the products that were bought? What was the currency? What was any discount? What was the shipping amount, and so forth. So properties gives us more information about the specific event or action, and we can specify. Just below, just check out started. Or if you're clicking a product, we might look at some of the product IDs, the SKUs, the categories, and so forth, right? So you can have an unlimited number of properties. I actually think the actual limit might be somewhere like 1,000, but it's large enough that you don't really have to worry about how many properties you're sending. And in many of the key events, you might be sending 10, 15, 20, 25 properties just to specify everything you want about the specific action. And that's really powerful. You'll see how we can then segment down in Amplitude later on once we have the right elements built in. So as we edit everything, we want to make sure that things are consistent, right? So if you use product ID in this structure here, whenever we use it again, we want to use the exact same thing. Or if you use something like revenue, just one word, lowercase, we want to make sure we use that elsewhere. So you can see that all at a glance in the tracking plan. And you can see you might have two events that perhaps look very similar. They have almost identical properties. You can condense those into a single event. So you're doing a lot of editing, you're doing condensing, you're doing tweaking, you're renaming things. It's very easy to do here before you ever write code. Once you write code, it's a lot trickier to make those changes. You have to go through some kind of request and ticket, and it has to fit in the sprint. Anyway, get it right in the tracking plan, put it all here. Once you feel happy with all the actions that you have, whatever those are, then you can figure out what the priorities are. I would say that for a first-time implementation, somewhere between 10 and 15 events has to be pretty good as a starting point. You don't want to do them all because it's just a lot of time, and some events are just completely irrelevant. For example, almost every product has like a forgot password action. Generally, that's not going to be very helpful for any kind of analysis. So there's not really a lot of point to implement that. So you prioritize. You then give this plan to your developers along with the SDK documents, which we're going to see in a second. And then from there, they can take it and implement it. So use a document like this or some similar format, but you really want to get this down as much as possible before you ever write code. One more thing, you tend also to have user properties, profile properties. Sometimes they're called traits. These are just attributes about a user that you may want to track. For example, first name, last name, email, as we see here. Maybe a user ID or when this user was created. So you can just also make a note of those. And you'll see in a second, Amplitude is really built at an individual profile level, and then everything gets aggregated in reports. This is a little different from something like Google Analytics, where it used to be all anonymous data, and you couldn't really go down to the individual profile. So generally, you're building profiles of users with all their actions and all the relevant user attributes that you want to pass on into the tool itself. So once you have your tracking plan, let's now look at the SDKs for Amplitude, just how you can implement data. The first thing to note is that you're going to have client-side SDKs, and you're going to have server-side SDKs. Now, the client side are typically things like JavaScript, iOS apps, Android apps, and server side to do things like PHP, Ruby, and so forth. You want to make a choice based on pragmatics and long term. Generally, the policy today, the recommendation today, the best practice today is to do as much as possible in the server side, in the backend, and as little in the client side for lots of reasons. You have ad blockers, you have increased data privacy, you have limits on the client, and so forth. Pragmatically speaking, it tends to be easier to get started with client side than server side. So many companies, once again, they might start very heavy on the client side, maybe 80% client, 20% server side. And over time, they can migrate events. I actually work with a company right now where we started very heavy on the client side. We needed data. We needed to understand this checkout that they were working on. And now we are replacing a lot of those client side events with server side events. This is, I think, about 6 months later. So you can do this in stages and phases. It doesn't have to be perfect from day one. Now, Amplitude has many different SDKs. You'll see very typical things. For example, the browser SDK. When we see the JavaScript SDK, and typically, this little snippets of code get added to your product. You initialize it, and then you have options to track events, right? So if we can track here the event name, like button click, and we can add event properties as we saw before in the tracking plan. Here's the user properties, just like before. We can pass on any specific attributes we might care about this user, such as their name or email. There are several attributes that Amplitude may track on their own. Things like city, region, country, browser, where the user came from, UTM parameters, and so on. So just double check the documentation, but a lot of these things tend to be tracked automatically. You don't have to do it yourself. And then there's some specific functions that you may become familiar with or may be relevant if you're looking at, right? If you want to track revenue, there's an option to track revenue specifically, right? There's groups and a bunch of other things. But that's generally it. This is the SDK portion, the browser SDK. Now we have Android, we have iOS, right? React Native, Node, Python, and so on. There is just a straight HTTP API you can use. So there's lots of different ways for you to implement data. It's very likely that the SDK you need will be here in some shape or form, or you can modify this for your own purposes. All right. Before we jump into the product itself, I want to give you just a final couple implementation best practices, just for you to kind of wrap your mind around what this data should look like inside Amplitude. How do you know that you achieved success? So let's actually jump into the product on the implementation side. So we are here looking at some sample data. This is a demo that Amplitude provides. Really helpful. So there's no need to show any personal information from some of my clients. This is the live events report. And this is just showing you all the live events that are coming into the product in real time. So typically in your product, you will see things come in, every few seconds, every few minutes. So this is your first step. When you start sending events, once you initialize the SDK, whatever SDK you're using, you then have to send them here, and this will tell us if the event is coming in correctly, right? Here's, for example, an event called favorite item or a complete profile and so on. Every event is being attached to a user profile that kind of looks like this, right? You're going to have a user ID. Here are some of the user attributes that we were talking about, right? Some of them, again, are automatic, like device type, carrier, the DMA, language, and so on. And some of them are manual. For example, if you look at maybe some of the A/B tests could be manual, could be seen as manual. So these are all just the user attributes of the user. And then now here we have the events this user has completed. You can see it's just a single profile of all their actions. The different events. Here's the favorite item event we were just looking at before. We see event properties here, right? You go back to our document. And then we can keep scrolling down and down and down, and there's just more and more events. And you can see there are different sessions that the user is doing, and maybe different devices, whether iOS devices or web devices and so on. So this is success. Effectively, once you implement the data, this is what the data should look like for your product. You should have a single profile for your users with all the user attributes that are important to you, and all the events and actions they have taken, they should appear in one single place. So if they have multiple devices, if they're perhaps using your product across iOS, Android, and web, all three devices should be in one single profile. They should be merged based on typically a single user identifier. This is like a user ID that comes from your product database. So if you're not seeing this, if you're seeing multiple profiles, if you're missing events, if you're missing properties or you're missing user attributes, you then have to go and double check this with your developers. But this is success. At the most simple manner, this is what constitutes success in the product. A single profile with all the data in one single place. Let's continue on and now finally look at the Amplitude demo. Now, there's a lot of sort of preamble before we got here, and it's important because The tool is fantastic. It's really powerful. It's easy to use once you understand it and get some training. But if you don't give it the right data, if the events are not logical, if you don't have the event properties, if you don't have the technical issues figured out, if everything doesn't appear as a single profile, everything's not going to work. And you might play the tool, but things have to get implemented correctly. One quick pause before we go on to the demo here of Amplitude. If you're looking for help implementing Amplitude among other tools, get in touch. I work with over 90 companies, helping them do this. On average, I typically save companies somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 and 3 to 6 months of implementation time, so you can get it done quicker, you can get more insights, and you can make sure that you're spending your money in the right tools and the right approaches. There's a link in the description, rubenugarte.com/analytics. Check that out. It contains everything you might want to know. Testimonials, how I do my work, previous clients, there's pricing. So if that's a good fit, get in touch through the page. The link is in the description below, rubenugarte.com/analytics. That being said, let's go back to the video. So we got the implementation right. So let's see what the reports kind of look like. Now, this is some of the new things that Amplitude has been working on. Again, the product is changing. I started using this product now maybe 7-8 years ago. And I've seen it change a lot over time. I particularly like this addition they added. This is a homepage in your product, and it gives you a lot of insights or out of the box, which is nice, right? Now, remember, like without you sending data to Amplitude, there's not going to be anything here. So this is not quite like Google Analytics, where you can just plug in the snippet to your website, and then Google Analytics tracks all this data for you, and you get all this stuff out of the box. You have to do the stuff we talked about, the track and plan, the implementation, and so on. But once you have it, before you ever build manual charts, you're gonna get some charts out of the box, which I think is quite nice. So very basic things though, right? This is an e-commerce store, so we're getting some visitors, some page views, bounce rate, a live view of using your product, some geographic data, and so on. So I like this. This is nice, right? If we go back to we were at live events, we saw that there is an LLM component, as you can imagine, as AIs and ChatGPT has become more popular. Now this LLM things that are coming here. I think this will be overall helpful, especially if you're not familiar with the tool. I think once you get really familiar with the data of the tool, it's sort of faster to build on your own. But nonetheless, it gives you sort of this more natural way to perhaps ask questions of your data. You still need to know what the events, what the building blocks are. And this is just yet another argument for why the events should be named logically. So someone could come in and say, what is the, how much revenue did we make last month? I don't know. Let's see what this looks like, right? So we'll take sort of the response, and because this is an e-commerce store, right? There's sort of logical assumptions that we can make. There's probably some kind of event called order completed or purchase, something along those lines. Inside that event, there's probably an event property that's called revenue or total or something. And then from there, it kind of builds a chart. So this is just, the more logical you make your data, the event names, the properties, the easier even things like this will be, right? Where you can then actually get this LLM to look for these logical elements and then build them for you. In this case, it looks like it did a relatively good job. We can actually open the chart just to see what it did. So yeah, so it kind of found, again, the event here is called complete purchase, logical. There's a property called revenue, and then from there, it kind of gave you the sum and so on. Again, right? This is all correct. So that's kind of cool. Actually, I think that this will be pretty interesting for teams as a way to kind of ramp in and help them build charts. Then there's some specific tabs here, some stuff for product analytics. I have seen reports around sort of daily active users, monthly active users. It kind of changed a little bit, which I think is also great. Very classic reports that get built. There's some onboarding. You can actually customize this. So you may have very specific events to customize what the onboarding actually looks like. Maybe some future engagement and so on. There's some web analytics. So Amplitude historically did not have good user attribution, but this has improved over time. It can track UTMs, typically first touch and last touch. And from there, it can then give you some breakdown of campaigns and show you which campaigns are driving sessions, purchases, and so on. Again, very cool, right? This is pretty comparable to what Google Analytics gives you out of the box. So I think just a really great addition. We have some users, so perhaps some user profiles. And then some things are kind of more advanced here, like predictions and cores and so on. We know those are the higher plans. Session replay, which we know again very similar to Hotjar and Clarity and things like that. And then they do have a experimentation add-on where you can run A/B test experiments within your product. This might be comparable to something like a WVO. Um, Optimizely, there was Google used to have their own tool. I think Google Optimize, which I think is no longer in operation. So you have all this kind of built in. Very cool, right? It kind of gives you a sense of your data once you implement it at a glance. And I used to build a lot of these dashboards myself, very basic things. And now these are not built, so we can kind of focus on the more specific, granular things for your product. Now, if we go in, let's go into the charts. So here on the side, we have some of the charts we're going to look at. We're not going to look at all of them. We'll start with segmentation. Segmentation to me is the core report in Amplitude, the one you really want to understand and build upon. And we can then go and take, let's go take the same event actually, the complete purchase. This is sort of the equivalent of the order completed we saw in our tracking plan. We choose the event and Amplitude right away gives us data. So let's kind of see what's going on here. We took the event complete purchase. We're trying to measure unique users, right? This is different, for example, from event totals. In this case, unique users will be the number of users who made a purchase, in this case, over the last 30 days. Event totals will be the total number of purchases over the last 30 days. A user, of course, might make more than one purchase. And in fact, we have something called average, which then shows us on average how many purchases users are making. The answer here seems to be somewhere around 1.1. Okay, so we have unique users. We have this 30-day timeline. We can make it 60 days or 90 days or any kind of combination, right, in between specific dates. We start with a line chart. We can then change that to perhaps a stack area if you want that, or perhaps a bar chart or a few other options. Let's actually keep it as a line chart. Down below, we have a table. For the data itself, this is primarily helpful for searching. If you want to search through records, you see in a second where it becomes more helpful than this. And of course, if you want to export it as a CSV, you can. Then you have a few options for the chart itself, right? You can sort of save the chart. You can put it to a dashboard. There's Notebook. Notebooks are sort of ways to show data alongside with text and other analysis. Kind of think about it like what people used to do in a Google Doc. They would take images of a chart, take it to Google Doc and write text. You can kind of do all that in Notebook. We can share this, right? So we might want to share this with other people. We can get the link and share it. So a few different things. Okay. Once we have this basic event though, the real magic is not just to plot it and get answers like this. You saw that was awesome, right? It took a few seconds. You see data in real time. So the data here is really up to the last few minutes. And if you think it's out of date, you can actually just refresh it manually. It will go get the latest data. So this is awesome. Some tools, I want to think Google Analytics in particular, can sometimes have this delay of 24 to 48 hours, which in this day and age just feels outrageous. Nonetheless, so we have this real-time data, and now we can start to break it down. So if we do a group by, and we go to event properties, we see very similar properties to what we used to have in our product tracking plan. For example, let's look what products looks like. So we have products, and this product in this case, they're all arrays. So this may not be as helpful in this specific manner. Just a couple other reports we can break it out. Let's see what else we might have here. Let's take, for example, country, which is not an event property. It's a user property. And I also want to note that you might see that some of these rows may have this Amplitude logo. Typically, these are default properties that Amplitude tracks in some form. So country, it kind of pulls that from the browser SDK. So we can break this down, and now we can see the total number of unique users who made a complete purchase by country. In this case, it might make more sense to perhaps go to like a horizontal bar. We can see absolute numbers. We can see relative numbers. Perhaps we then want to break this further to city, another default property. And again, we start to do this breakdown. So you can imagine there's so many permutations out here that you can do with the event properties once you have this. You can see exactly what are people purchasing, what's the relationship between shipping rates and purchases or tax rates and things like that. Down here, we might create segments. I won't get too much into this, but you can effectively start to create groups of users based on behavior. So you may say, show me all the US users who were acquired from Facebook and who made a purchase of at least once in the last 30 days. That's group one. And we're going to compare it to group two, which is going to be all Canadian users who came from Google Ads and they made a purchase in the last 30 days. And then from there, we want to understand what's the average number of purchases, what's the total number of purchases, and so forth, right? So we can start to build this report, and we're all doing it in this portion here, which is kind of like, it's really similar to SQL. If you've seen it, if you perhaps you just have some familiarity with it, but this is much more friendlier for people who are not technical. You sort of click and drop in values to build your query and build your chart. So this is segmentation. Fundamental report, really helpful. Once you understand it, you kind of get the bulk of the features. Then you can take the tracking panel, the data, and then start to build all kinds of different values and filters and group bys, right? Let's go on to funnels. So funnels are really amazing. You can start to see sequences within your product. This e-commerce data, of course, has a checkout funnel, a very classic e-commerce checkout funnel, but there's all kinds of funnels and all kinds of apps. Think of like a food delivery app where you might have this food ordering funnel of steps that you should have to go through. You know, they have to search for a restaurant, add items to their, what's equivalent to a cart. They add items to a cart, then they check out to the cart, and then they make the order, and then perhaps they receive it. So, 5, 6 steps. So we can start to build funnels here of all kinds of permutations. So we have this complete purchase. Let's go find the, this probably some kind of product view. Let's see what we got. So we have an add to cart, which is great. We're going to reorder it because we want to here actually. And we're probably going to have a view of some kind. Maybe view item details might be the logical one. Okay. So simple 3-step funnel. Again, we can build in a few seconds. The data is logical, right? Remember that. Even if I'm not fully familiar with the data and if I understand what the product is, what's the purpose of the product? Is this a meditation app? Is this a game? Is this an e-commerce store? I should be able to then go through and sort of pick out the relevant events. So here, what this is telling us is step 1, they view the item details. This is probably like the product page. Step 2, they add a product to cart. So what right away we can see that about 55% of users add a product to cart after viewing it, and then of those 55% users, 17% make a purchase. The total conversion rate for this funnel is 17.5. Now you can play around this in several ways, right? We can once again break this down by country, if we guys stick with our very basic breakdown. And we can see then the conversion rate across countries, across the entire funnel. Let's reload that for a second. We might see the conversion over time. So how is this funnel conversion, that 17%, how is this changing over time? Perhaps the time to convert. So how long does it take users to convert through this funnel, right? Whether that is 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour. And we can actually play around with the conversion window right here. They completed within 1 day. We can make this, you can see there's days, hours, minutes, and second. We can make this, 30 days. So we can have a wide conversion window. So you can start to see very wide conversion funnels, not just necessarily a funnel that might take place within sort of like this 10-minute, 15-minute window, like an e-commerce store. We have, again, count unique users or total conversions, which might change the reports a little bit. And again, we have the segments as well. We can kind of build those segments here that we were talking about before, the Facebook ads versus purchases and Canada versus US, bring them here, and then break this funnel out into two funnels. Funnels are also a great way to look at A/B test experiments in particular. So I just recently built this actually last week, where we're running this A/B test experiment with a control and one variation. We quickly build out the users who are participating in the A/B test experiment based on events. Then we break out into the two segments, and we can see the conversion rate of those users. And actually, this one here, this option here, significance, is Amplitude's way of trying to determine if a specific variation, in this case, a specific segment, is statistically significant from an A/B test perspective. So you can see this is kind of built in. So if you have the data in the right structure, then it can be quite easy to even look at your A/B test results inside Amplitude and be able to see their impact all the way down to really any kind of event in your product. So not just the top level conversions, but the lower level ones. Funnels in particular are very helpful for marketing people. I work with a lot of marketing teams that they may have top level metrics like clicks, maybe signups for their campaigns, but they don't really know if those signups are actually onboarded. Are they actually making purchases? Are they being retained 30 days and 90 days later? And again, Amplitude then makes that easier by just having the attribution data in here, right? I do believe this account probably has, yeah. Something like UTM source, UTM campaign. You may have last touch UTM and first touch UTM. So you may have the level of granularity and then be able to show those specific users and track them all the way down weeks and months later to see what their actual engagement is. So this can be really, really valuable from the perspective of marketing attribution. Okay, so that's funnels. And let's look at, let's say a third report, which would be retention. Retention is fantastic. This is a classic cohort analysis report. And in here, we're typically looking at some kind of starting event. For example, we want to look at new users and then some kind of returning event, like complete purchase. So what this report is telling us is how many new users were added over a specific period. In this case, let's actually make it weekly, just to make it a little easier to read. So this is telling us that on the week of September 16th, there were 61 new users. And of those users, then within the first week, 3%, 3.5% made a purchase. If we actually go down here, perhaps to this row, on July 1st, there were, again, 63,000 users. And then we can see what percentage of those users that made a purchase either in week 1, week 2, week 3, and so on. So if you have a mobile app, you're likely very familiar with D7, D30 retention, day 7, day 30th. But this is the same for perhaps subscription businesses, B2B businesses, where you want to understand what is the retention over time. And because we have all the building blocks here, we can look at retention in lots of different ways. It can be as simple as a new user became a paid subscriber. So we have perhaps an event called subscription payment. Or you may have something much more elaborate. You want to understand how many users are actually coming back and using the core value of your product. If you're a fitness product, like I mentioned before, how many users are coming back and actually doing one workout every week. And you can then filter here and perhaps have a specific number of events you want to look at, how many users are coming in and doing at least 2 workouts, 3 workouts, and so on. There's a few other things around here about retention that I won't get into completely, but this is fundamental retention. Very helpful report to understand long-term engagement of a product, how valuable it really is to users beyond the first few days. This is one report that you'll need time no matter what. So once you implement data, you might need 2, 3, 4 months before you can even use this report, as you can imagine, because of the nature of it. But once you have enough data, once you have a few months of worth of data, it can be very helpful to then track this and understand how this is performing. And once again, any segments, any kind of breakdowns, we can then understand their overall retention by those specific groups. So let's just do a quick final things, just overviews, journeys, just gives you different paths of users from an event. So, once the user signs up, what are the different paths they take? Or perhaps what are the different paths a user takes to sign up? Report that requires a little tweaking and thinking through to really get some value out of it. Sessions we looked at, data tables are just actually exactly what that sounds like. You can build tables of data, just helpful to, if you want to build a sort of more data structure report, less so a chart. And down here in the more, a lot of this tend to be the machine learning reports like engagement metrics, persona, stickiness. There's actually a great blog post by Amplitude on how these reports work if you want to look at them. They tend to be in the higher pricing plans to start. And 2, you really need enough data volume to justify them. So somewhere in sort of the millions of conversions before they become really, really helpful. So if you're not quite there yet, don't fret. But it also tells you that as a company, you can actually grow with Amplitude. It'll be a while before you really outgrow Amplitude, if at all, right? The ability to have really advanced reports here that only really make sense once you have enough data can be really, really powerful. A couple final things I want to mention here is we have dashboards like this, right? So you can take all the different charts we made, put in here. You can kind of play around with how it looks visually. You can add some text. You have spaces, which are folders effectively, right? And the folders allow you to group things and kind of share them with different people. Here's the notebooks we talked about before. So again, you can sort of imagine this sort of like Google Doc structure. It's being walked through specific analysis. There's charts that are being shared, maybe links or videos being added. So just a way to share the analysis instead of just sharing a specific chart. I find it really helpful. Sometimes just sharing a specific chart doesn't carry all the context that's needed for something. So by being able to give a single link still that has all the thinking and arguments, I think can be really powerful. And then let's see if we can see this is kind of like the CDP portal that we were looking at before. You do have destinations and be able to export data. I would look at this in more detail if this is what you're looking at. Generally, when it comes to CDP in Amplitude, you're really exporting two things. You might be exporting cohorts. So you group users into cohorts, into groups, and then you're exporting those users out to perhaps an email platform. So you imagine you create a cohort of your most engaged users over the last 30 days. That cohort has 1,000 people, 1,000 users. And then Amplitude can export those 1,000 users to MailChimp. And it's exporting the emails. And from there in MailChimp, you can then target them. That's one way that the CDP can work. The second way is it can export actual events. So it can do what is sometimes called event streaming. So all the events that are coming into Amplitude, the complete purchase, the view details, the add to cart, those events can then be exported to a different tool in its complete structure with the event properties and user properties. That is more classic CDP, what you may expect with like segment.com. But you want to look at the destinations, what they support, what they don't support, and see if they fit. Again, not as powerful as segment.com. I would consider it a full-on replacement, but it's building and they're adding more destinations and sources over time. So it could be good enough depending on what your use case is. And that is all I have for today. We cover a lot, right? We look at the use cases, what Amplitude is really good for, why you want to use this tool, what makes it so powerful. We look at the pricing, understand what that might look like from an MTU basis. We looked at the tracking plan, right? A key prerequisite before you ever really get into the product itself to really maximize the product. We looked at SDKs, talked a little bit about the client versus the server side debate that can sometimes happen. Some implementation best practices, of course. What is success in the tool itself, what you should be looking at from a technical perspective. And then, of course, we look at the demo itself, segmentation, funnels, retention, a quick glance at some of the other reports, the CDP, dashboards, and so on, just for you to get a sense of what the product looks like. The more work you do upfront to get your data in, to make it logical, the easier everything is, to the point that it may match what I showed you here, right? Very quickly build reports in a few seconds, segment them, break them down, share them, save them, and so on. But you have to go through the right steps. So that's all I have for this video. My name is Ruben Ugarte. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. In the description box below, there'll be several links that you might find helpful. First, there'll be a link to that track and plan Google Sheets that I mentioned and showed earlier before. You can open it, make a copy, take it to your own team and use it. There'll be a link to analytics help if you're looking for that. That's rubenugarte.com/analytics. And then there's a link to just subscribe and even actually to buy my book, The Data Mirage, which talks a lot about the work that I've done and some of the things that get in the way for companies to use their own data. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you next time.